a warm summer night in southeast Fresno, what should have been an ordinary gathering of friends spiraled into a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. It was June 14th, 2015. Music drifted through the neighborhood, the bass thumping from speakers set up inside a modest house where a group of young people had gathered. Laughter and chatter filled the air, but beneath the surface of celebration was an undercurrent of tension that only a few could sense. Among the guests that evening was 21-year-old Andrew Tristan, a young man with his whole life ahead of him. Those who knew Andrew remember him as charismatic, full of energy, and loyal to the people he loved. But in Fresno, where gangs dominate entire neighborhoods and allegiances run deep, history is rarely forgotten. And that night, history would come back with a vengeance. As the party carried on, another figure arrived. Sebastian Gonzalez, a young man with ties to the notorious Bulldog gang. For decades, the Bulldogs had cast a shadow over Fresno. Unlike many other gangs, which formed alliances or claimed territory beyond their hometowns, the Bulldogs were deeply entrenched in Fresno itself. Their reputation for violence and their fierce independence from larger prison gangs made them one of the most feared groups in the Central Valley. Gonzalez wasn't just a name on police files. He was a familiar face to law enforcement, someone whose involvement in the gang world had already marked him as dangerous. And as fate would have it, Gonzalez and Tristan had crossed paths before. Their relationship defined not by friendship, but by conflict. According to investigators, the two men shared a history of tension, a rivalry that had simmered beneath the surface until that fateful night. Inside the party, alcohol flowed, conversations turned louder, and the crowded space became a powder keg waiting for a spark. When Andrew and Sebastian finally came face to face, the spark ignited. What began as words, a heated exchange, reminders of past conflicts, quickly escalated. Witnesses later recalled shouting, a scuffle, and the unmistakable tension of two young men carrying the weight of grudges and gang affiliations. Then, the night exploded into violence. Gunshots rang out, shattering the fragile illusion of a party. Panic erupted as guests scrambled for cover, ducking behind furniture, diving to the floor, some fleeing into the streets. In the chaos, Andrew Tristan fell, struck multiple times by bullets. He collapsed, gravely wounded. Another victim, a 15-year-old boy, was also caught in the gunfire. A reminder of how indiscriminate gang violence can be, pulling innocent lives into its orbit. For Andrew, there was no escape. When police and paramedics arrived on the scene, they found him clinging to life, his body riddled with wounds. Despite desperate efforts, he succumbed to his injuries shortly after being rushed to the hospital. At just 21 years old, his future was gone in an instant. News of the shooting rippled through southeast Fresno, a neighborhood already familiar with violence but never fully hardened to its effects. Family members wept outside the crime scene, their grief colliding with disbelief. How could a night that began with music and laughter end in bloodshed? For law enforcement, the crime scene was all too familiar. Shell casings scattered across the floor, frightened witnesses reluctant to speak, and whispers of gang involvement. Fresno police knew immediately that this was not a random act of violence. It bore the hallmarks of gang rivalry, the kind of feud that had plagued the city for years. Reporters captured the scene, their cameras flashing against the dark backdrop of the neighborhood. The killing of Andrew Tristan wasn't just another statistic. It was a human story that would once again highlight Fresno's struggle with gangs, particularly the Bulldogs. The Bulldogs, or Fresno Bulldogs as they are often called, trace their roots back to the 1980s. What began as a street-level group evolved into a formidable force, claiming dominance in Fresno and resisting the control of larger prison gangs like the Mexican Mafia. Their independence made them unpredictable. Their loyalty to Fresno made them entrenched, and their violence made them feared. Gonzalez was one among many drawn into that world. For him, the gang wasn't just an affiliation, it was an identity. And that identity carried lethal consequences. Andrew Tristan's death marked more than the loss of a single young man. It represented the cyclical nature of gang violence in Fresno. Rivalries born from past conflicts, escalations fueled by pride and retaliation, and families left to pick up the pieces. In the days that followed, Andrew's loved ones gathered to mourn him. At vigils, friends described him as someone who deserved more time, someone whose story should not have ended on a floor stained with blood. His family demanded justice, even as they knew the path to justice in cases like these was never simple. Meanwhile, the Fresno Police Department launched into action. Detectives began the painstaking process of piecing together what had happened, working against the clock and against a wall of silence often found in gang-related cases. Witnesses feared retaliation. Others simply refused to get involved. But detectives knew they had a suspect. And in a city where gangs ruled with intimidation, pursuing that suspect would require persistence and determination. By the end of that night, Southeast Fresno was quiet again. The party had ended. The music was gone. All that remained were the echoes of gunfire, the flashing lights of police cruisers, and the beginning of a murder case that would stretch on for years. Andrew Tristan was gone, but the search for his killer had only just begun. In the wake of Andrew Tristan's killing, the Fresno Police Department faced a familiar challenge. Another young man had been gunned down in a neighborhood already worn thin by years of gang violence. Another family left shattered, and another case where silence threatened to bury the truth. For detectives, the June 14th shooting was more than a crime scene. It was a puzzle. The house was crowded that night, yet as investigators canvassed the area, they encountered the same refrain. I didn't see anything. Some partygoers were too traumatized to speak, others unwilling to cooperate, fearful of being labeled a snitch in a city where that word carried dangerous consequences. Still, Fresno police had one undeniable advantage. This was Bulldog territory, and the Bulldogs were not just another gang. They were the gang. Law enforcement knew their faces, their histories, their grudges. They knew the Bulldogs had a stranglehold on neighborhoods in Fresno, with thousands of members ranging from street-level soldiers to hardened prison veterans. The Bulldogs were notorious for their lack of structure compared to other gangs, but what they lacked in hierarchy, they made up for in sheer numbers and loyalty to their city. Detectives quickly identified a prime suspect, Sebastian Gonzalez. His name surfaced repeatedly as they pieced together fragments of the night's events. He was no stranger to law enforcement, his record already scarred by run-ins tied to his Bulldog identity. Witnesses whispered his name, some reluctantly, others with outright fear. Gonzalez, they said, was at the party. Gonzalez, they said, had clashed with Andrew Tristan before, and Gonzalez, they believed, had pulled the trigger. But identifying a suspect and proving a case were two very different battles. Investigators needed more than whispers. They needed evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of the courtroom. Over the next 2 weeks, Fresno police chased down leads. They conducted interviews, gathered forensic evidence, and mapped out the movements of everyone inside that house. The injured 15-year-old boy provided a painful reminder of the recklessness of gang violence. A teenager, wounded simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Detectives hoped his presence might encourage more witnesses to step forward. Community members, meanwhile, were torn between fear and anger. For Andrew's family, grief fueled a demand for justice. They pleaded with the public to come forward to help police ensure that Andrew's death was not just another unsolved gang murder. The Fresno Police Department echoed that plea, reassuring residents that their safety was a priority, that silence would only empower the killers. Finally, on June 26, 2015, nearly 2 weeks after the shooting, Fresno police made their move. Officers tracked down and arrested Sebastian Gonzalez. The young Bulldog member was taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder for the death of Andrew Tristan. For Andrew's family, it was a moment of relief, though bittersweet. Justice, at least on paper, was beginning. The arrest made headlines across Fresno. Local news stations broadcast the story, naming Gonzalez and linking him directly to the Bulldogs. The case served as yet another reminder of how deeply gang culture had woven itself into the city's fabric. In Fresno, almost every resident had a story, a cousin, a friend, a neighbor, who had been touched by Bulldog violence. Now the murder of Andrew Tristan was added to that long, tragic list. Behind the scenes, however, detectives knew their work was far from finished. An arrest was only the first step. Convicting Gonzalez would require a case strong enough to withstand the defense's challenges. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and began preparing for what promised to be a long, difficult battle in court. The gang angle complicated matters. On one hand, Gonzalez's Bulldog ties painted a clear picture of motive, a long-running conflict with Andrew Tristan, now ending in deadly violence. On the other hand, prosecutors' new defense attorneys would argue that gang affiliation unfairly prejudiced jurors, making Gonzalez appear guilty by association rather than by fact. Meanwhile, the Bulldog gang itself loomed large in the background. The Bulldogs were not an abstract problem. They were a daily reality in Fresno. With an estimated 14,000 members in and around the city, they outnumbered many rival groups combined. Unlike other gangs tied to national networks, the Bulldogs thrived on their independence, refusing to bow to the Mexican mafia or other prison gangs that demanded tribute. This defiance made them unpredictable and emboldened their members, who often felt untouchable on Fresno streets. For Fresno police, every case involving a Bulldog carried the risk of retaliation or intimidation. Witnesses feared that testifying would put their lives in danger. Families worried that speaking out could make them targets. And jurors, even in the safety of a courtroom, sometimes struggled with the knowledge that their verdict could carry consequences beyond the walls of the courthouse. Still, investigators pressed forward. They built their timeline of the night. They collected ballistics evidence linking the bullets to Gonzalez. They mapped out witness testimony, however fragile it might be. Piece by piece, they constructed a narrative. A party turned violent, an old conflict reignited, and a young life ended in a hail of bullets. By the time Gonzalez sat in a jail cell awaiting trial, the case had become more than a local tragedy. It was a symbol of Fresno's ongoing war with gangs, a reminder that the Bulldogs were not just a street-level nuisance, but a force capable of devastating entire families. For Andrew Tristan's family, each day that passed without resolution was a painful reminder of their loss. For the Fresno Police Department, each step forward was a battle against silence, intimidation, and the brutal cycle of gang violence. The investigation had led to an arrest, but the road to justice was only beginning, and it would prove to be long, complicated, and deeply frustrating. When Sebastian Gonzalez was arrested in June 2015, the Fresno Police Department and Andrew Tristan's family believed justice was within reach. Prosecutors moved quickly, charging Gonzalez with first-degree murder. It was the most serious charge available, one that carried the possibility of life behind bars. For Andrew's loved ones, it seemed like the legal system was finally stepping up to confront gang violence with the full weight of the law. But what looks simple on paper is rarely so in reality. From the beginning, prosecutors faced enormous obstacles. The evidence against Gonzalez was strong enough to warrant an arrest, but proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt was another matter entirely. Witnesses, already reluctant to speak with police, became even more hesitant once the trial loomed. Some gave conflicting statements. Others backed out altogether, unwilling to face the consequences of testifying against a Bulldog gang member. The Fresno County District Attorney's Office was all too familiar with these challenges. In cases involving gangs, fear was a constant companion. Witnesses risked not only their own safety, but also that of their families. Jurors could be swayed by doubts if testimony seemed shaky or inconsistent. And defense attorneys seized on every contradiction, painting the prosecution's witnesses as unreliable. For years, the case dragged on. Hearings were scheduled, postponed, and rescheduled again. Legal motions were filed and argued. At one point, the case was even dismissed, only to be refiled as prosecutors fought to keep Gonzalez in court. Each delay was agonizing for Andrew Tristan's family, who had to relive the trauma of his death over and over while the justice system struggled to find solid footing. Inside the courtroom, the stakes were immense. Prosecutors painted a picture of a violent gang member whose long-standing feud with Tristan erupted into deadly violence. They emphasized the context. This was not a random shooting, but the result of a rivalry tied to Fresno's gang underworld. Ballistic evidence supported their case, and the timeline investigators built showed Gonzalez at the party, involved in the fight, and ultimately responsible for pulling the trigger. But the defense countered aggressively. Gonzalez's attorney argued that the case was far from airtight. With inconsistent witness testimony, they claimed, the prosecution could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Gonzalez was the shooter. Yes, he was a Bulldog gang member, the defense admitted, but that did not make him guilty of murder. The defense also pointed out that gang affiliation could unfairly bias jurors, making them believe Gonzalez was guilty simply because of who he associated with. The courtroom battles stretched on for years, leaving Andrew's family trapped in limbo. Every time a new hearing was announced, they prepared themselves to hear the details of Andrew's final moments once more. Every time the case stalled, their hope dimmed just a little. By 2018, it became clear that the case was in jeopardy. Witnesses were too inconsistent. Memories had faded. Some testimony conflicted so sharply that it threatened to unravel the entire prosecution's narrative. Without solid, cooperative witnesses, the chances of securing a conviction for first-degree murder seemed slim. Prosecutors faced a painful choice: risk losing the case altogether, or pursue a lesser charge that might still hold Gonzalez accountable. That choice came in the form of a plea deal. In January 2019, after nearly 4 years behind bars awaiting trial, Sebastian Gonzalez appeared in court and entered a plea of no contest to voluntary manslaughter. The decision stunned some observers. How could a first-degree murder charge collapse into manslaughter? But for prosecutors, the answer was clear. It was the only realistic path to ensure Gonzalez would serve time. Under the deal, Gonzalez faced a maximum sentence of 7 years in prison. Because he had already spent nearly 4 years in custody since his arrest, He was expected to serve only about a year and a half more before release. For Andrew's family, it was a crushing blow. They had waited years for justice, only to watch Gonzalez escape a potential life sentence. The courtroom that day carried a heavy silence. For Gonzalez, the plea deal was a lifeline, sparing him from the uncertainty and risk of a full trial. For Andrew's loved ones, it felt like the system had once again failed to deliver the justice they believed Andrew deserved. Legal experts noted that the deal was not unusual in cases like this. Prosecutors often face impossible odds when witnesses refuse to testify or when evidence lacks the clarity needed to convince a jury. The goal becomes ensuring some measure of accountability rather than risking a total acquittal. But explanations did little to ease the pain of those who had lost a son, a brother, and a friend. As the gavel fell and the case concluded, Fresno was reminded once more of the difficult balance between justice and reality in the fight against gang violence. The court battle had spanned nearly 4 years, yet the outcome left many feeling that justice was incomplete. For Andrew's family, no sentence could ever bring him back. But watching Gonzalez walk free after just a few more years behind bars was a bitter pill to swallow. For the Bulldogs, it was yet another reminder of how their shadow loomed over Fresno streets and even its courtrooms. When Sebastian Gonzalez entered his no-contest plea to voluntary manslaughter in January 2019, the courtroom moment carried a sense of finality, but also deep frustration. For prosecutors, it marked the end of a long and grueling process. For Andrew Tristan's family, it felt like the justice system had let them down. The deal spared Gonzalez from a potential life sentence. Instead, he faced a maximum of 7 years in prison. With credit for the nearly 4 years he had already served, Gonzalez would spend only about a year and a half more behind bars before re-entering society. For Andrew's family, who had endured 4 years of hearings, delays, and painful reminders of their loss, the outcome seemed far too lenient. In court, Gonzalez's attorney explained the reasoning. The state's case was weakened by inconsistent witness testimony, and a murder conviction would have been difficult to secure. The plea was a compromise, an assurance that Gonzalez would serve time rather than risk a trial that could end in acquittal. But to those who had buried Andrew Tristan, it sounded like an excuse. Outside the courtroom, emotions ran high. Friends and family spoke of Andrew's life cut short, of his potential, and of the hole left behind. They wanted Gonzalez held fully accountable, not allowed to walk free after serving a fraction of what they believed he deserved. The case highlighted a painful reality in Fresno's war against gangs. Securing convictions is often as difficult as battling the gangs themselves. The Bulldogs, with their deep roots in the city, cast a long shadow over witnesses, jurors, and even prosecutors. Fear of retaliation silenced voices that might have otherwise strengthened the case. Without cooperative witnesses, the justice system struggled to hold Gonzalez to the full weight of his actions. For Gonzalez, the plea deal represented survival. A first-degree murder conviction could have meant life behind bars. Instead, he would see freedom again while still in his 20s. For law enforcement, it was a reminder of the limits of the system. They had done the legwork, tracked him down, and built the case, yet in the end, the realities of courtroom strategy and human fear dictated the outcome. As the years passed, Andrew Tristan's name became part of Fresno's long list of victims claimed by gang violence. His story was not unique, and that was perhaps the most heartbreaking truth. Fresno has seen hundreds of young men like Andrew, sons, brothers, fathers, cut down in their prime, their families left to grieve while their killers navigated a justice system ill-equipped to fully confront the scope of gang violence. The Bulldogs themselves remained as entrenched as ever. Their presence continued to shape neighborhoods, schools, and entire communities. To law enforcement, they represented a generational challenge, one that could not be solved by arrests alone. Every year, new recruits replaced those who were locked up, ensuring the cycle of violence continued. For Fresno residents, the story of Andrew Tristan's murder and Gonzalez's plea deal carried lessons both painful and urgent. It revealed how fragile justice can be when fear silences witnesses. It showed how gangs exploit that silence to maintain control, and it underscored the fact that behind every headline, behind every plea deal or courtroom technicality, there are families who live with the consequences forever. In interviews years later, members of Andrew's family still described him in the present tense, as if refusing to let death erase who he was. They remembered his laughter, his loyalty, and his dreams. Their grief was a reminder that while cases may close, wounds remain open. In Fresno, violence often feels like background noise. Sirens in the night, headlines on the evening news, names and faces scrolling past too quickly. But Andrew's story stood out, not because it was unique, but because it was tragically familiar. A young man with a history of conflict, a gang member unwilling to let the past go, and a city caught in the crossfire. The courtroom's final gavel didn't bring closure. It brought compromise. It brought reality. And in that reality, Andrew Tristan's life was worth more than 7 years, more than a plea deal, more than the system could offer. As Fresno continues to wrestle with its gang crisis, Andrew's story lingers as a haunting reminder. The fight is not only against the gangs themselves, but against the silence, the fear, and the limits of justice. Each case, each trial, and each plea deal reflects the larger battle for a city trying to reclaim peace from the grip of violence. And though Sebastian Gonzalez walked free far sooner than Andrew's family ever believed he should, the memory of Andrew Tristan, the young man who lost his life that night in 2015, remains. In Fresno, his story is one among many, but for those who loved him, it is everything.